ActionSA has announced its departure from the multi-party charter. The party says it has reviewed its relations with other political parties amid coalition talks. Now, during a briefing yesterday, National Chairperson Michael Beaumont said the charter has been breached because the agreement ruled out a working relationship with the ANC. Well, let's speak to Beaumont now about all of this. He joins us in studio. Michael, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I asked you before we went on air what time you went to bed. I think a lot of us would have gone to bed really late last night, waiting to hear from the African National Congress coming out of their NEC meeting. I think let's start with that, right? Your view on the ANC president announcing that they're looking at forming a government of national unity.
Well, I mean, we're watching with a great deal of interest. We ourselves have expressed a view that we would not want to take up such a position because we have a concern about what we call a conflicted opposition in South Africa. What happens to the opposition who has historically played an important role in exposing the countless acts of corruption and malfeasance that has taken place, particularly over the last 20 years, when they are now given corner offices, blue light vehicles, government-sponsored mansions and higher salaries. When they find that corruption going forward, they're now facing a decision. Do we do what's right, or do we do what keeps our own government in place? And a conflicted opposition with an ANC in government is potentially one of the most dangerous things. So we are looking at it from the outside saying that we are not going to participate in such a process, but at the same time, we are recognizing the need for stability. So we will watch, we will observe, and we've already committed to the South African people that we will play the role of what we call a constructive opposition. Ultimately, if proposals come across our desk that are good for the South African people, we will support them. We will not be in opposition for opposition's sake. But at the same time, when there needs to be accountability and the opposition is too conflicted to provide it, we will need to be the unofficial opposition in South Africa.
Okay, so I mean, we've taken a look at I suppose, the agreement that was signed off on by parties that were part of the multi-party charter. Section 7 of that obviously talks about the agreement amongst all of you that you're not going to be working with the African National Congress. When you step away from the charter, what does that say about parties like the Democratic Alliance and the IFP? I mean, there's questions certainly about the fact that they have talked with the ANC. We heard that from the president of the African National Congress last night. Are you stepping away because there is a sense that they will be working with the ANC?
Oh, absolutely. I think we must be very clear. In August last year, these parties came together and they signed an agreement. And that agreement was explicit about not considering working relationships with the ANC. They campaigned on the basis of that agreement to the South African people. And when your members of the media go and pose them questions about what they're going to do with the votes after the election, they ducked and they dived and they evaded that question, all the while winning votes on the alternative, saying that they want to rescue South Africa and now they want to give those votes back to the same party from which we allegedly need rescuing. And ultimately, we feel that there's been a betrayal of the South African people here. If there was going to be an openness to this, it should have been much clearer from the start. It was absolutely denied that this is where it was going. And we see that a multi-party charter has started to become a bit of a collective bargaining agreement, something to how people can, hunt with the hounds and run with the foxes. And from our point of view, we did not want to be a part of that. We were very clear to the South African people that we are here to build the alternative to the ANC. We don't think you can fix South Africa in partnership with those who have broken it. And from our point of view, that means we needed to walk away to preserve our own integrity.
Last week when we were at the Results Operations Center, we spoke to one political analyst, who made an interesting point, and I wanted to put this in front of you, right? He said essentially what happened here is that political parties such as ActionSA, IFP, even the Freedom Front Plus were decampaigned by this multi-party charter, that you yourselves as political parties were duped into signing this charter, and in fact, had you not, you would have held on to some of your voters.
Well, I think it's part of that I agree with and part of it that I don't. The idea that being outside of the charter would have been a better result is kind of negated by the look at what Rise and Bosa achieved. So that was hardly the secret to party growth either. And I think South Africans genuinely wanted to see political parties that would work together in their interests. And that's why we joined. We think it was the right decision at the time. And we did so entirely in good faith, because when a political party calls that many members of the press to come and report on an agreement that says we won't do something, I mean, surely you think, my goodness, how would they do a 180 on that? But I think you are right. I think the intentions were not always pure. And there's no question that the Charter was used as a vehicle to decampaign some of the partners. We've obviously witnessed that. We've obviously made our decisions going forward. And I think what we are looking forward to is a period of time where ActionSA is going to stand on its own 2 feet. We're going to be the best ActionSA that we can be, and we're going to do so untethered and unencumbered by partners with baggage.
Yeah, well, let's give you just a quick reminder of what it is that we heard last night from the President of the African National Congress. He has essentially said that the ANC is looking at forming a government of national unity, right? And then they've talked about how they have been in talks with the EFF, the Inkatha Freedom Party, the Democratic Alliance, the NFP, and the Patriotic Alliance. You, of course, note that he did not mention ActionSA, and perhaps we need to talk about whether or not those discussions have happened, right? And then, of course, we need to be reminded of the fact that they did say, as the ANC, that they reached out to the MK Party, were snubbed by the MK Party, and then later on yesterday we're hearing that the MK Party may very well be keen to talk with them again. Can we talk about this list? The EFF, the IFP, the Democratic Alliance, the NFP, and the Patriotic Alliance. I think EFF stands out in that list of parties that the ANC has spoken to. So when he talks about a government of national unity, do you understand that to be all of these parties included, and that you have not been included in that discussion at all? Have they reached out to you?
They haven't reached out to us. I think for what it's worth, ActionSA's clarity on where we stand in relation to the ANC probably puts us very far down the call list. And for what it's worth, we don't lament that situation. We're very happy with it. We would be very happy to tell the ANC that they should focus on calling others, because we would not be involved in a working relationship with them. But from our point of view, we are watching and observing this with great interest. The challenge that I think is going to really arise here is a government of national unity really only requires 2 of those political parties to have a majority. Everyone else is effectively window dressing to create a dynamic that is not just a 2-party coalition which has political downfalls for both of those parties. And at the end of the day, what's going to probably be of concern is when that coalition government starts to function, decision making is going to deal with this idea of sufficient consensus. Sufficient consensus is when the 2 bigger parties agree and everyone else kind of has to take it. And I think that's going to be an interesting concern going forward, especially given some of the coalition experience we've had and the degree to which arrogance can predominate in those larger parties.
I'm concerned, though, that, you know, there's this idea that, you know, when you say the words government of national unity 30 years into democracy, South Africans think back to 30 years ago, right? When we spoke these words and we talked about bringing political parties together. I mean, some of the media houses this morning are even comparing Ramaphosa to Mandela, saying this is a very Mandela-esque way of approaching leadership and governance in the country. Why not then join this new dispensation and hold hands together and say, well, perhaps we can hold you accountable? Perhaps the right question is, what is an unofficial opposition? And opposition is opposition.
Well, it's going to become a new concept we're going to have to learn to understand in South Africa, because the danger when you talk about a government of national unity, what really happens is that larger political parties co-opt other political parties into a government space, and suddenly the opposition space gets silenced. Because every day the opposition is going to come across stories where there has to be accountability, there has to be transparency, and there has to be a strong voice that is holding government to account, especially as we've seen over the last 20 years with ANC governance where corruption and malfeasance has been a regular occurrence. And the problem when a political party is in a government of national unity is when they come across those examples, they're going to have to make a choice. Do we do what is required of an opposition and hold them accountable and expose the story? Or do we think that that might damage our government and bring instability and potentially collapse the arrangement that we are now benefiting from? And that's the conflicted opposition that we are concerned about. From our point of view, we don't want to spend a lot of time debating what that opposition's going to do. That's their choice. We're saying there has to be an opposition in South Africa that is unconflicted, that stands alone, that is not bound into any agreement, and can do the hard work of holding a government to account in an environment where the opposition has been muzzled.
Yeah. Okay. So if you are in opposition and you've walked away from the multi-party charter, one would hope that you've got some idea of what is in the workings here, right? I mean, here's the issue. We had the press briefing last night, and the president essentially saying, government of national unity, we've spoken to these parties, but dialogue still needs to take place around the modalities. Do you have any idea of what modalities we might be looking at?
Well, I'd imagine they'd be talking about a written agreement and they'd want to start examining the things that would bring about stability. You know, we can't really have motions of no confidence flying around like we've had at a local government level. And no one wants to import that experience into national government. So I think there'll be a bunch of discussions around that. And from our point of view, again, we would see our role, even if we are standing alone, to be that constructive opposition. We don't want to bring instability. We don't want to be the party that is causing damage to the confidence in our economy or our country.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's got to be someone who's looking after the interests of the people of South Africa in opposition when no one else is doing it.
Allow us to be a fly on the wall. What did the conversation look like between ActionSA and the Democratic Alliance when you realized that you needed to step away? What did that conversation look and sound like?
Well, it was actually profoundly disappointing because it took place at a meeting on Saturday evening. In that meeting, the DA had called for a meeting with the multi-party charter. When the meeting began, they didn't appear to really have any desire to make any discussion of any kind. And really what was clear about it to us is that they had already made plans elsewhere. So really they were ticking a box. There was no discussion about exploring pathways to governing, even if it's a minority pathway, where we were bigger than the ANC in places like Gauteng. So it was very clear that their arrangements were already well in the works, and don't believe for one moment the PR that this suddenly started only after the election. I think this has been a long time in the making.
Well, were there never signs? I mean, even before the elections, you know, one of the things that we noticed during the results coming in was that the Freedom Front Plus, for instance, and the Inkatha Freedom Party had a very different idea of how leadership was going to be decided within the multi-party charter. Surely these are issues that should have been sorted out a long time ago.
Well, they were sorted out, and I think in many ways our partners have left a lot to be desired in terms of how seriously they take agreements, because you're absolutely right. I watched an interview with both of those parties, and it was like they had signed two different documents, and yet they'd all signed the same document. They all say the same thing. And I think there's a casualness about agreements and working arrangements in a coalition environment that shouldn't be there. And I think particularly serious to us is that there have been signs with the DA. I mean, you look back to 2019, the DA has been talking about the very scenario that is played out right now. So I think for a long time this has been part of the plan. As an organization, we had just imagined that when they signed an agreement and presented it to the South African people, that they had had a change of heart and they were committed to the word of what they had signed. The fact that they haven't, however, is between them and their voters, and ultimately it doesn't involve us any longer. I'm
wondering if this means ActionSA is left out in the cold, and essentially what I'm asking is you're not willing to work with the ANC. What happens if the Democratic Alliance says, well, come on, let's sit down and talk once again? Would you go back to sit down with them? Who are you willing to talk to?
Well, we're always willing to talk to political parties. We don't think an environment of saying we're not willing to talk is helpful. I mean, ultimately, we're in an environment where talking is a bare minimum, has to be part of a requirement. But from our point of view, that talking has to be predicated on the idea of building the alternative to the ANC. That is the commitment that we have given since the formation of our party. It remains as true today as it did back then. And the people who voted for us and the people who have come to like ActionSA know that that is our position, and it is an uncompromising position. And I think to change that position now would really be a fundamental betrayal of the position we have provided to the South African people. And we're not a party that's going to say one thing and do another.
Yeah, okay. We're gonna move towards wrapping it up. What's next for you? I know that you're looking, your next goal now is to focus on LGE 2026.
Oh, we must be clear. The crises that face South Africa, while we are focusing on it at a national level, the experience of government failure for most South Africans is the lack of water coming out of their pipes, an unreliable electricity supply even outside of load shedding, a broken road network, and people who are quite literally being submerged in sewage. These are the issues of local government. It's probably the biggest failure in South Africa. We noticed in the election that our ballot was highest on the provincial ballot because I think South Africans like their action local. And we need to understand more about that. But ultimately, we want to be on the ground. We want to be campaigning. We have just 2 short years until the local government election, which truly is a scary prospect for people in our 2 industries that are still trying to deal with the sleep deficit of the national election. But there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, lots of work to be done indeed, 100%. Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure having you in studio, Michael Beaumont, Chairperson of ActionSA. Share your thoughts on that discussion. @Newzroom405 is the handle